Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and welcome to this live CoinDesk webinar. My name is Nick Lord, and I'm the moderator of today's event. The overarching question that we were going to answer, going to attempt to answer today is what will it take to drive the next generation of crypto advisors? But things have changed in the last few days, and they've changed a lot. So to reflect that change, we are going to address what's been going on in the markets, what it means in the short term, and then how to overcome these challenges in the medium term. And we're going to look at this through four distinct lenses. We're going to look at the security and protection of the end user, specific regulations that will help to legitimize and improve the crypto industry. We're going to go into DeFi and the AML KYC conundrum. And then last but not least at all, we're going to discuss how we can improve the user experience and why proper UX, UI design in crypto will go a long way. My panelists today are two absolute luminaries of the industry. First, we have Hal Lonas, who's the Chief Technology Officer of Trulioo, the electronic ID and address verification company. He is a recognized innovator in cloud security and machine learning, and a long-standing champion of automation technology. And secondly, we have Brian Mosoff. He's the CEO of Capital, a public company that's focused on yield generation and building institutional grade infrastructure to support the Ethereum ecosystem. He's been actively involved in the crypto industry for over a decade. So he's a real long-term server of this industry. I want to remind the audience at this stage that there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. Please just write your questions in and they will come through to me and we can address those. If you can keep them on topic, that would be great, but we understand there's lots of uncertainty in the markets, and do feel free to use us for some insights and some reassurance that you may need. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the obvious. What's been happening? FTX coming after Celsius and Terra Luna. It just seems so familiar. Brian, what's your take on all this and what does it mean?
I mean, my reaction, of course, like many, is that it's an unfortunate moment in the industry. As someone, though, just for some perspective, who's been around for about a decade now, this doesn't surprise me in that I've seen many things take place throughout my time in this industry that no one saw coming. They didn't think would happen. They're certainly unfortunate events. They're unfortunate for the people who will lose some of their assets, people who will lose their equity in those businesses. But what's important is not to lose sight of the plot, that the industry will build back better because of this. It will figure out what new transparency needs to be put in place, new protocols. There'll be perhaps better education for new entrants to the industry. They'll look at things like self-hosted wallets or diversification. So long-term, despite the short-term pain, I think it's a positive thing, and just a reminder not to just treat this space as a FOMO asset class and jump on to hype, and really do diligence and education and research before people participate, whether they're funds or retail investors. But the space will be okay, and it'll just take time to heal.
Hal, do you have any reactions to what's been going on?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And I think, I'm a huge believer in crypto and the future of this technology in the industry. So I think it's a matter of, we're going to see some unfortunate events occur. We've just seen one. I think, Brian touched on it, but the trick is to learn from this and move forward and look at what we can all do to help that happen. I think, we're going to touch on, some of these items today on just how we can help the industry mature, but we're certainly going to see that. So I think, unfortunate, but to be expected.
I mean, it's probably too early to draw any real conclusions from what's happened. I think it's still too early to see about the specific case we all have in mind. But more in general, how can we improve security and protection for the end users specifically? I'm not talking about investors and I'm not talking about counterparties, but really for the end users. How can we improve their security and protection to stop these to stop the bad impact of these implosions having on them in the future? Brian, you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you're going to start to see exchanges emerge doing maybe real-time proof of reserves. where you have purview into their balance sheet at any point in time. It also highlights how efficient DeFi can be, where people who interact with these assets through self-hosted wallet and an on-chain trading experience instead of a centralized counterparty, why that's so important. And there's opportunity here to continue building out the DeFi ecosystem to making that more accessible. And of course, that's partially what we're here to talk about today. And so I think that people are going to, over time, move towards those solutions instead of these kind of siloed black box, basically traditional finance solutions that are just touching crypto assets in the space. And that ultimately would be better for the end user to have more transparency, to have better governance in place, to have proof of reserves, to have more options in DeFi and better wallets. That will build a better space and one that's better for the end user.
Is it a question that the end users need to, what responsibilities do they have? You know, I think you have a view on self-hosted wallets, that people shouldn't rely on a third party holding their bearer assets. What's your view on this, and what can end users do to educate themselves?
Yeah, I'll let Hal chime in here because I know he's been looking at this for a while. But my view is that there's going to be a spectrum of users. There's people who will be comfortable with self-hosted wallets and that responsibility, and we need to work to make that UI better. Seed phrases are complex. A lot of the wallets have weird terms to newcomers that to us, maybe transaction fees denominated in these weird currencies seem normal, but there's a lot of nuance to this industry, and it takes time to understand how to use those tools, those browser plugins. Some of them are better than others. So there's some users who are tech native, who are comfortable with those solutions. And then there's others who still want to lean into a centralized counterparty. And theoretically, that's okay. The question is, how can we build even better centralized counterparties for those users to remain safe? Hal, do you see things, I'm assuming, the same way?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And I agree. And I think, how do we make, some of those very technical aspects accessible to more people? And, Trulioo is all about accessibility, in a lot of different facets here. But one of them certainly is this, technical depth of knowledge, I think, to understand the nuances today. And I think to the extent that we can make that easier for average people to understand and consume, and then more confident that they'll make the right decisions and won't do something that will be kind of a one-way path to losing money or doing something that they don't intend to do is really key to, I think we're helping the industry mature by making those technological advances, just hiding all that kind of ugly detail from end users.
I think we're going to address that in some detail towards the end of the conversation. I really look forward to hearing your views on how we can do that, and specific sort of taking a sort of tech design approach to this. But I suppose one of the most obvious impacts of what's been going on is that there is going to be increased regulatory scrutiny. The regulations are already up in the air. There's a lot moving, a lot to come out, a lot's been signposted that's going to happen. When you look at the upcoming regulations, what do you see that is positive for the industry?
Yeah, look, I mean, we're going to see a lot of increased regulations, right? And we're probably going to see that trend accelerate. I think it's a really good thing, honestly. None of us like to hear about kind of oversight and regulations, and we think of it as bureaucracy and red tape. But look, if it helps onboard new users and gives them confidence in the industry and what they're doing, then that's a great thing. So I think to the extent that we embrace regulation and understand it and help move forward, that's a wonderful thing. And I think a lot of the complexity here, I think, in the coming years is going to be geographic specifics. So kind of being mindful of kind of one region over another and one jurisdiction over another, how those regulations change, and sort of embracing the complexity that we're going to need to do to keep this wide open and growing.
One kind of a little bit of a pushback here, though, would be, as much as I think clarity around regulation is good in that the people who want to operate above board in certain jurisdictions definitely need that clarification. Regulation by enforcement isn't good for anybody. So I'm certainly excited for there to be clarity around stablecoin issuance and how exchange oversight should exist. That's all good stuff. My concern, though, where I'd push back a little bit is what I don't want to see is a bifurcation in the space. The purpose of crypto, the reason that you have blockchains is not to recreate the financial system with a little bit of efficiency. It's to have these global settlement layers, either clearing a single asset in something like Bitcoin or any asset type in something like Ethereum or another smart contract platform. And if you bifurcate that accessibility because of certain regions or certain jurisdictions have various mandates, sanctions lists, then what have we really accomplished? So I think it's important that as much as, yes, we do want regulation, we do want to be compliant, we also understand that the end user doesn't necessarily think about regulation. Sometimes they will, but most users, in my experience in this space, they want access. They want access to various assets, various activities, could be DeFi, NFTs, staking, whatever it is. And if it's not offered through a local platform because of some regulatory hurdle that hasn't been crossed yet, that end user actually is not protected, sending them off into the Wild West to find an access point. Because if they want access to the asset, they are going to find a way to buy it. And they may be buying it somewhere that has much higher risk. Maybe it's worse in terms of custody. Maybe there's it's not even the token that they wanted. It was a derivative of the token, or it's some scam. So I think it's important to keep in mind that as much as regulation is important, we also need to keep in mind what is the purpose of the asset class and what does the end user actually want? And the end user wants access regardless of where that exists.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I think, and I don't know how far we could go with bifurcate or trifurcate or quadfurcate or whatever, but yeah, I mean, we risk getting into a very, just a complicated environment. And I would agree that nobody wants that. I think, I think what we all hope for is uniformity and things that make sense across, so that you're not searching for, across jurisdictions or trying to use fancy, network tools to try to come in from one place or another. So I think that's absolutely right.
Great. We've got a specific question coming in about regulations, and this is what is required to better protect segregated customer assets. I think this is clearly very important for what's going on right now, but it does seem to me a kind of a TradFi solution to a DeFi problem. What's your answer to that? Brian, how do you?
I thought Hal was closer to the centralized exchange world, but yeah, I mean, I think that is where this is going. I think that's probably a very good thing. Again, any transparency on these centralized exchanges, segregation of accounts, not mixing customer funds with perhaps a treasury that they're managing. That seems to be a very common theme we've seen this year that has not ended well. So all of that, I think, should be embraced. And then again, for the users who don't want to be on those platforms, give them options through self-hosted wallets. And one of the keys that I've constantly been pointing out to regulators in my view is the best thing you can do to protect investors is force a lot of disclosure around if a user wants to withdraw their asset, that's fine to me. Let them go off into the Wild West, but make sure that they're armed with education and resources to know the risk that they're taking on when they take possession of the asset. So I think, again, you're going to have people who will end up in different boxes, centralized exchanges, self-hosted. The question is, should you segregate their assets and protect them better when they're in these centralized, siloed custody solutions? Absolutely.
How do you, I mean, Brian was talking about what people really want is access. How do you think the regulations around KYC and onboarding, how are they developing from your aspect?
So I think that's, an area that we're very in tune with, and we see that getting tighter all the time. That's kind of our specialty is that onboarding step and KYC. And of course, separating out the bad actors and security concerns from legitimate customers, and, the specialty of applying kind of the minimal and right amount of friction to that onboarding process. So I think, when you think about the goal of access, certainly the first step of onboarding is critical. And it not only, kind of sorts out good and bad for the, for the exchanges or the industry, but it also, I think, can convey confidence to the onboarding user that they're coming on to a legitimate, well-established and well-run concern. So I think, there's a lot of, nuances here and a lot of sort of messages that are conveyed through that user experience that are really important.
Yeah, I'd also just add to that totally agree in that removing as much friction to onboarding into whatever environment that user wants to participate in is really key. Requests for multiple sets of documents, proof of this, wait for an email to come back, within a few days. It pushes users away, they give up, they end up maybe staying with a single solution because they're already onboarded there. So the more you can lower that barrier and all of that friction to allow them to move between different places that are appropriate for whatever activity it is that they're trying to achieve, the better.
Yeah, that's right. We're on 4 of the top 5 exchanges. We onboard customers there. So we see tons of this traffic, and we really can help advise our customers on what works and what doesn't work, and all of the nuances of that. So keeping that friction level really low as possible in the regulatory and compliance environment where they're operating is absolutely key.
Fantastic. And we were talking just before we went live about how, are there the service providers, the professional service providers out there that can actually help to enforce or at least turn some of these new regulatory paradigms into reality? Is there the level of support there for you as companies and for the end users to be comfortable with?
I mean, I would say we're a public issuer. We're listed in Canada. There's a lot of complexity around how to exist in that type of environment or that type of structure. I think that there's a lot of interest from regulators, from government to figure out how to get this right. The lexicon of this industry is so detailed, nuanced, complex, evolving every 35 seconds. And the narrative and the plot kind of keeps changing, that it's really hard, but it does require industry to engage and put in the legwork to help them figure out what is the appropriate framework. And we started to see a bit of that, from industry working with Washington to say, here's what we think a framework should look like, who the oversight should come from. And we need more of that. We need more voices and more time and resources spent putting in that time, because if we don't do it, the industry is just going to go sideways and we'll never be able to move forward.
Yeah, we agree. And I think, we see it as a partnership when we engage with a customer and say, how do we work with your compliance team and help them understand what we've seen. Ultimately, you're responsible, but we are here to partner with you and advise and, based on our experience, provide options that we think will work and help with that guidance. But absolutely, the partnership there and the sharing of knowledge, best practices, what works and what doesn't work, really helps our customers get on board and become productive faster and stay compliant.
Is there a correlation between?
Can we go back 1 second? I just thought of something with the customer funds thing that I wanted to put in, because it actually kind of speaks to this regulation question, which is what's tricky about when you set up any of these rules, because it seems obvious in a single, yes, we shouldn't commingle customer funds for a bunch of very good reasons. And then a new product or the industry evolves. What's tricky is that the industry evolves, and then maybe there's a reason you want to mix those customer funds. An example would be, let's say you had a number of users on a centralized exchange who wanted to stake, but they didn't hold enough of their assets to run a single validator. So on Ethereum specifically, you need 32 ETH pooled together to run a validator and stake and generate that yield. There would be no way for that user to participate if you didn't wrap up 32 ETH of various customers on the platform to run a validator together and then split out the yield. So we have to be mindful that as much as we want the regulation to protect the investors as best as they can, recognize that there are these nuance or asterisk situations that may actually require you to mix customer funds to do a certain type of activity. Sorry, that popped into my head. And I think that that's important to remember, that regulation is not so cut and dry on good, bad. There's all these little scenarios where you might actually want to do something different or have a different clause or a way around something, because the end user, again, is going to try and want to generate yield or do a specific activity and then be blocked, or the platform isn't able to offer it because of something that they're being compliant on, but then it blocks them from some business activity, and then ultimately they lose that customer to another jurisdiction.
Absolutely. It's the second law of Newton's thermonuclear regulatory dynamics, that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, doesn't it? But I mean, you mentioned something about, customers wanting to stake, or they want to do certain activities. Do you think the next wave of crypto activity will be driven by the same user activity, the same desire on the part of the end users to achieve a certain end, or are things changing? And certainly, we missed the wider picture, which is that what's going on in the TradFi markets. Is there a case that these two markets are moving in slightly different directions, that there is a different use case for each?
I mean, I think that the use case is widening over time. If you go back to the early 2010s, 2011, 2012 era, you basically just had Bitcoin, and then Bitcoin then creates a bunch of other assets because people clone that code off GitHub, and you have Litecoin and Peercoin and Feathercoin, people looking to do other ways of having digital money or a store of value. And then in 2014, you have these smart contract platforms that begin to emerge. And then by 2017, you start seeing the beginnings of DeFi and maybe the seeds of NFTs. And then by 2020, you have the narrative of Bitcoin is really turned into this potentially, check on central banking policy. You have the metaverse emerge, NFTs become a whole vertical and a whole industry really on its own. And so that will continue to happen. I think within each of these verticals, stablecoin payments, they will continue to exist. There'll be a subset of users who are just focused on that vertical. And that's great that you have sole industries dedicated to just that use case of cross-border payment using stablecoins. That's great. Over time, as someone who's been around, and I kind of just painted what that picture has been, you can expect that the road is going to continue to widen, and that there are going to be use cases that begin to emerge either, in the depths of the bear market here or whatever comes in the next cycle that we can't even predict now. And the thing that's exciting, the reason people should still be paying attention to crypto is underpinning all of this activity are these settlement layers, are these things like Ethereum, where they're clearing all the assets and all the activity. And so what investors can do in times like this is to say, I'm not going to speculate on the verticals. And if we can get pension funds and hedge funds to say, maybe I should focus away from just equity in these businesses and really understand that the point of these tokens is to remove agency. That's why they're there. They're there to remove the agency as much as possible. So to speculate on an agency that's going to extract rent instead of having a protocol that can facilitate the same activity, probably more efficient, cheaper, with more transparency, that should get investors' attention. And that's where they should be saying, maybe it's time to start allocating direct to the protocols, generating yield through something like staking. And so that I think is what's interesting is perhaps this recalibration for people in times like this to where is really in 5 years or 10 years, what are the assets you really want to own?
Yeah, I mean, just to comment on that, I think the way I see this is we've really got to expand the number of use cases. And I think, the verticals we have today are fine. And I think, great kind of almost like early adopter and some specific use cases that can't be accomplished any other way. And so that's great, right? That's perfect. But I feel like the next wave needs to be more inclusive of people with maybe TradFi use cases, but things that, and I agree with Brian, things we haven't envisioned yet. So I think, we're going to maybe reach a tipping point, and who knows when, maybe soon, on use cases that really appeal to the masses. And then, we could see the next broad wave of adoption. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm actually sure it will happen. I don't know what it is, but I'm sure we'll see it, and we'll look back and say, oh yeah, that was the turning point for where everybody wanted to be in crypto for various reasons, but there'll be something that will be the mass appeal.
One thing I hear though a lot in meetings is people asking me, institutional focused investors, saying, what are the real businesses? Like, what are the real use cases? How is this world out here going to use these protocols? And kind of what sometimes I like to challenge on that question is they're looking to map one-to-one some activity that already exists here and just say, well, if that can exist in this new environment, then that must mean that crypto or these networks will be valuable. And I think it's actually the wrong way to look at this, because if you think about the early internet days, I kind of joke to some people, well, the internet didn't become valuable, or you didn't validate that the internet one day would have value because the post office started offering electronic mail. or that magazines would just digitize their content. The things that you couldn't predict were the things that were so fascinating. You know, Twitter is right now probably the most important website in my view on the internet, despite whatever chaos and people think it's going through right now. That social communication tool didn't exist as a business in 1985. Libraries were not the most valuable business in the world, but then you have something like Google that emerges. And so I think, yes, there's certainly efficiency gains to be had by traditional finance, figuring out how they can tokenize equity bonds or just use these settlement layers for payments. And that's great. I'm all in favor of it. But I do think that investors need to understand that some of the bizarro world activity, if we want to call it that, is probably going to be what some of the most important use cases are going to be for crypto. It's not going to be businesses or activities that you can mirror exactly to the current world that we know and are familiar with.
Absolutely. It's like, you know, in the 19th century, they were well aware of electricity, and it took 50, 60, 70 years before Thomas Edison came along and said, well, let's make light out of it, you know, rather than just as a sort of fairground attraction to make people's hair stand on end. So yeah, absolutely. I think the use cases we're only just imagining it. And I think it's one of crypto's most interesting, and also maybe one of its most unfortunate aspects, is that the first manifestation was as money, as opposed to, as you say, you know, one of these protocols that can actually facilitate wildly different activities that we're not sure of quite what they are yet. We've got another couple of questions from the audience, which actually times as well, because we're going to go into DeFi. So do you think that DeFi will accept fiat from TradFi, thus eliminating CeFi? That's an interesting concept of something that might happen as a result of what's going on right now. Brian, do you want to take that?
I mean, I'm not exactly sure what the accept fiat would mean. I do think that you're already seeing a real opportunity actually for the US, where the quote currency in most of DeFi is some flavor of USD. Whether those stable coins are regulated on-side or off-side, it's a real opportunity for the US to lean into, that pretty much the entire global crypto ecosystem uses USD as the quote currency for their activity. Some of it will happen in ETH, some of it will happen in maybe Sol, you know, if they're using Solana. And so I think that we already are seeing that those flavors of fiat are coming into this world. Whether there's a more efficient way to go direct from a bank account or from, I don't know what you would have on your phone into that world, that still seems fairly far away to me. And I think that a lot of people aren't comfortable yet. You know, the most non-tech users aren't comfortable in DeFi. And to be fair, nor should they be. It's a crazy world. There's buttons you have to click. You have to understand all these terms, connect to your wallet. Did you connect to the right thing? I mean, I wouldn't want someone who wasn't familiar with this technology to just run off into DeFi and start trading. And so I think that CeFi definitely has a place, and there's an opportunity here. The question will be, when can the banks get comfortable with the asset class? When can auditors say, we're okay with this? When the banks say, we think that we'll be on side with engaging in this activity. Right now, a lot of them don't want to bank crypto companies or engage in the activity themselves because it's not clear what the rules are. And so that just brings back that point of why we need the regulation, because at least at a minimum, we're going to get clarity on how to operate in a compliant way. And then those banks can decide how should they engage, where is it appropriate, where is it not appropriate, and what role do they want to play?
Great. What are your views on how DeFi will evolve in the wake of everything that's been going on, and specifically around although it's not germane specifically to the CeFi collapse this week, but around KYC and about weeding out bad actors. How can DeFi grow and at the same time protect its users?
Yeah, and so just backing up a second, I think interoperability is a great thing, actually. So the more that you know, DeFi and actually the entire, you know, crypto industry is intertwined with you know, TradFi and additional or current institutions, I actually think that's a really good thing. I don't want to hold it back, but I do think being interconnected is actually a really healthy thing. You know, and then going forward, I think when you think about you know, users and AML and regulation, you know, certainly is going to become, you know, more important if that's even possible. But I think, you know, super important to make sure that users that are on the platform are all safe and secure. I don't think any of us want to be, on, with an institution or trading or, have an asset that, we're worried that we're a guppy and right next to us is an invisible shark, and we're going to get, taken down or kind of consumed by that. So I think it's just, really important from a safety and security concern that we all have that level of confidence.
Brian, do you think you can have DeFi growing at the same time as increased focus on KYC and AML?
I mean, my view of all of this stuff is that what we're trying to do here is give people choice. That's what I want to see for the space. I think that's the purpose of also these assets is let people choose. And as Hal's saying with interoperability, although it's a term I usually pull more towards just crypto interoperability, I think you want people to have their assets be fluid wherever they want to move them. You want to lower that friction between they're in DeFi, then they go to a centralized crypto exchange, and then they go to their bank account because their bills are paid in US dollars. You want to make that as seamless as possible and let them choose where they want to hold those dollars and how or what assets they want. That's the fantasy that I have. When I think about all of the anti-money laundering and KYC requirements, I think it will be challenging for DeFi to compete with a more open set of protocols if they get too bogged down in regulation. And it will start to mirror back to the financial system that we have today with perhaps some efficiency, and those users will find a way to route around it. So somewhere here, there needs to be a balancing act. I agree with Hal that people who want to trade in a certain pool or against a certain set of participants that have been vetted in a certain way, I think that's great, and there should be that opportunity or that front end. But I also don't want to see that we completely block off global liquidity and all of the really interesting development because we're checking off a bunch of regulatory boxes. When we say things like safety and user protection, what does that exactly mean? I mean, I think most of the time we're referring to, we don't want customers to lose their funds. We don't want their assets to be stolen. We don't want them to be wiped out in some kind of trade where someone just was able to take advantage of some technical whatever. But at the same time, we also want them to have access. We want them to be able to participate. We want to inspire the next generation. The next set of job growth is going to come probably from this space. It is one of the most intellectually interesting areas to be in right now. And when I think about someone who's 15 or 20-year-olds today graduating university, I don't see that they're going to be that interested in working in a traditional financial institution. Of course, some will, and there's great jobs out there, but I see a huge opportunity in a wide design canvas working in crypto and solving a lot of these complex problems. If we gate their access, if we gate their participation, if we don't allow them to touch some of these experimental new protocols, things that need to be vetted necessarily maybe by code, then will they be able to participate, or will they just be blocked and all of the really interesting activity in the next iteration will happen outside of the US? I would hate to see that.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think one of the analogies that comes up for me is around cloud computing. Like we talked about the internet a little bit ago, but think about cloud computing, and many technologists now don't even think about where something is deployed or where things run, right? We just think of it as like it just happens, right? And actually, the more kind of distributed it is, the better, because it gives you redundancy and resiliency and a bunch of other benefits. So when you think about like cloud computing and where we are with some of the regulations around like GDPR and PII, I see a very parallel sort of setup coming in DeFi, right? Where it's like, okay, same problems are going to exist. And I think, Brian's right. I think that more and more businesses want to operate globally, and they want to operate, in a lot of countries, not limit users to one area, one jurisdiction. So we've got to enable, at every facet here, global participation, and not think about, users in this country and users in that country, because the users don't think of it that way, and the businesses shouldn't have to think of it that way. So I think we've got work to do behind the scenes to enable that, and it's really hard work, but that's the work that needs to happen to enable this. And I think that's another big part about kind of powering that next wave of adoption, is taking care of some of those gory details.
And two things that I'd also add. One is, someone once said to me, if we had the existing type of regulation that is applied to money and asset and trading, if the internet in its infancy had the same type of regulation and jurisdictional challenges, would it have evolved to what we know today? I think we'd all agree the answer is absolutely not. And we probably don't want that internet if it were to have, developed in that type of a system or structure. And so how you balance these things out, I don't know when it comes to money and exchanges and trading. I understand the spirit of how it's all being thought of and debated, and hotly debated, I should say. But I also recognize that we also don't want to just put, a certain set of users in a very small jurisdictional box and ignore everything else that's happening in the rest of the world. And this conversation is very linked to, we don't have to go too into this rabbit hole because it's a different topic, but as countries are looking at digitizing their currencies, whether you want to call it a CBDC or an official stable coin, whatever it is, to me, those conversations, and I've sat in a number of rooms about them, I think right now, a lot of the people thinking about those problems are designing them in isolation of what's happening in this open and more global crypto financial system. And they're assuming that, let's say right now, 98% of transactions that take place in the US are denominated in US dollars and 2% happen in some type of Forex, tap at a payment terminal. But the world that I see coming in the next decade is that a new cohort is going to emerge that says, I don't want to hold my net worth necessarily all in US dollars, and I'm comfortable holding Bitcoin or fractionalized NFTs. And as marketplaces become more fluid, as those payment terminals can plug in to some of these crypto payment platforms, I think the worlds are going to become blurrier and more gray between how people pay, what assets they're holding, what they're comfortable with. And that's a real challenge and something I think governments need to focus on. How do you remain relevant and incentivize users in that world? And that's something that I'm very passionate about, is knowing or thinking about what in a decade is likely to be true. And are we building for that, or are we getting bogged down in the weeds of paperwork of today and missing what's going to really take place, and how the world is going to reshape itself over the next 5 to 10, 15, 20 years? That is really important because these worlds are very linked.
I would agree. And it's interesting again to look at that internet analogy, because I think some forces try to wall off peoples and countries, right? And I think that's an uphill battle that they won't win in the long term. So do the people rise up and say, tear down this wall? And will they do it on the internet? Yeah, I think so. Will they do it in DeFi? Yeah, I think so. So I think it's a good point, right? So once you have kind of an enabling technology that doesn't care about borders, then I think you bet on that's where it'll go eventually.
And it's also important because you hear a lot of the time people say we need to regulate crypto or regulate Bitcoin. And you always have to remind them, you can't regulate at the protocol level. The protocol doesn't attach an IP address to a transaction. You're not going to regulate Ethereum. You regulate the access points. You can regulate some of the activity on those access points, but you can't regulate crypto. You can regulate how people are getting their exposure to the asset. And I'm not saying if it's good or bad. I'm just saying it's important to make that distinction that you can't regulate crypto. You just regulate how people participate in the asset class.
Well, that brings us to a question from the audience. What is the role of ID verification in crypto adoption? Does it help, and where does it hinder? And I think this can be looked at from a geographic point of view, from all the different countries with their different requirements and different regulations. But then also exactly going back to Brian's point, how do you regulate it if it's not? I mean, you can only regulate it at the point of onboarding, right?
Yeah, I mean, ID verification is a good thing, right? I mean, and I think we look at it in a very sophisticated way now. So, for example, you can apply different amounts of friction and take any customer through a very customized journey. And I don't mean customer by customer. I mean individual by individual can be looked at in a kind of a dynamic onboarding experience that's right for them and right for the company that they're onboarding. So, do you want to do only a bare minimum of data collection? You can do that. Do you want to put them through a little bit more friction with document verification or something else? yeah, you can do that too. Can you make it vary by age and geography? Absolutely, you can. So I think, it doesn't have to be one size fits all. It's not, one onboarding experience fits all. So, and I think going through that is a really, kind of revolutionary and new thing we're doing that really helps the industry.
Yeah, and anything that can lower the friction, again, I mean, we've kind of touched on this already, is really key. The end user just wants to do a certain thing, buy a certain asset, participate in some activity. And so you need to remove that friction. And I think that users or people generally are getting more sophisticated or catching on to, they don't want a ton of their data collected. They're tired of having their email inbox essentially be spam at this point. Twitter bots has become a problem. And so as Hal's saying, the minimum amount of data collected to allow them to perform an activity, people are going to lean into. It will allow businesses to make sure that they're operating in a compliant way. So as much as I am pushing back somewhat on this, what I was saying before about not bifurcating the space, I do see that there's a lot to be gained from having these tools out there for businesses to offer out, whatever they're doing to a new set of customers, while not putting those customers at risk for data leaks, information being sold in the back end. People end up getting spammed. SIM swapping has become a big problem. I've actually been SIM swapped twice. It's a huge pain in the butt. And so, yeah, I don't want my information sitting in a bunch of places. And it does stop me sometimes when I want to go to a different exchange or a different platform. And then you hit that, hey, upload your government ID. Hey, we need to send you an SMS, 2FA, whatever. I run a VPN and I go to some big, box store I needed to buy sheets, and the website blocked me. And I'm like, why, if I'm running a VPN, does this website care? I'm looking at their linens. And so I think that the world is trying to figure out how to navigate these things. They recognize that some of it is very important. Some of it is maybe a little too overreaching, and striking that balance and a minimum light touch, I think, is what's going to win and create the best experience for everyone.
Yeah, and that's so true. And we see every one of those, onboarding experiences and where customers experience that, where that dropout occurs. And then we're able to go back to our customers and say, could you take a little less, or could you do it differently? Or could we give them a little more reassurance about how we're treating their data? And we see the improvements happen as we go through that journey. So absolutely, looking at that in a lot of detail all the time.
Well, I think that ties nicely into a question we've got from the audience, the next item on our agenda, and what you said before about interoperability and bringing together the need for interoperability with how UX designers should focus their attention when it comes to designing new crypto businesses, crypto platforms. What more can be done? And perhaps more importantly, how can it be done better?
My answer to this is less focused on actually the design of the applications. I think where there's a big hurdle is in the lexicon of the industry. The terms don't mean anything to people in the real world. If you open a MetaMask wallet and you're trying to do a transaction and it says, like, the nonce is too low, or gwei, whatever it is, these aren't words to regular people. You don't want them to learn those words. The same way that most of us didn't want to sign up for our own email addresses in the mid to late 90s because we didn't want to figure out POP, server, SMTP. You're going through this process and you're like, I just need to send an email wishing someone a happy birthday and say, I'm sorry I didn't attend, even though I didn't really want to go. You're just trying to do this thing, but there's so much friction there. And it really takes a business coming along like the Hotmails and the Googles, who say, we're going to abstract that complexity away. You don't need to know those terms. You don't need to have a certain set of technical qualifications to, plug in a modem and do this and sign up for here and then download this program. It's too much. And so the more that we can, I think, abstract away all of that technical jargon from people, the better. What do they really need to know? Perhaps there's, an advanced and a light mode. I'd love to see wallets that do this, that focus on what does a regular person need to know? Don't call something like network fee or gas fee, just say transaction fee. That's it. So I think if we can do some work around the wording of things and making it more accessible to more people, that would be a big thing. The design of these applications, to me, will come within time. That to me is an easy problem to solve. The wording, as the industry grows itself out and offers out new assets, new tokens, new ways of trading, new ways of yield farming and staking, like, we need to make those things accessible to a new group of users if we want to onboard the next 100 million plus people.
Yeah, that's right. And how many of us have looked at an end user license agreement that pops up on the screen, all the legalese, right? And it says, read all this, and you're like, where do I find the button where I click yes, or how quickly can I get past that? I mean, so a typical example, right, of like, how do we, we have legal and compliance obligations, we have things we got to do, but how do we make it as seamless for the end user as possible, not scare them off because we don't want them to go off and go to a competitor, but satisfy what we need to do. And, I'm just here to tell you that like everything matters about that experience. The colors matter, the fonts matter, the order that we go through, how fast it happens. There's a right speed. There's, not too fast, not too slow, that convinces the user that they're doing something legitimate. So it's amazing. And, we do a lot of like A/B studies to say like what onboarding flows work, and what don't work, and allow our customers to compare those journeys and say, aha, I get 2 percentage points better if I do it this way. So, all that experimentation and making it as easy as possible for everybody to experiment and see what works is also just part of it.
Yeah, the nightmare scenario for me, I agree, I have everything that you're saying. The world that I see that we're a little bit too close to, in my view, is imagine going to a website and the first thing that it says is, okay, you got to connect your wallet, and you hit the connect button. Then, oh, sorry, first I forgot that there's like a cookie disclosure tracking thing that you need to accept or reject all, or view which ones you want to turn on and off. That one drives me nuts. So you've got that point of friction. Then you have a connect wallet button. Then maybe you have a, hey, your wallet's not verified. Click here to input your phone number for 2FA. Please upload a piece of ID as your second form of verification. Like, think of how many things we are now doing to engage with some very basic services. And I think there's a different thing when we're talking about financial interactions, and there's some things that are appropriate there, certainly. But the internet generally is creating all these points of friction. And this goes into your whole thing of the more you can lower that, the more we can move back towards let the user do whatever they're trying to achieve as quickly as possible, as seamless as possible, abstract away as much as you can into the background. That's better for everyone.
Yeah, totally agree.
Fantastic. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to move to the Q&A from the audience, and we have a number of questions building up. So let's start with this. How does the regulation conversation engage with KYC AML requirements that we see today or expect to see in the coming years? So, is it going to get more onerous or less? Hal, what do you see?
Well, I think it's going to get more onerous. I just do. But I think, the trick for all of us is to hide that complexity. And that's been, a theme we've been on today. But how do we absorb that? I think we know it's coming. We can advocate against it. But, I think we know it's coming. And then the other thing that I would say that is, again, a theme we've had today is let's all work for uniformity. So, kind of establish a best practice, and then uniformity everywhere, not different jurisdictions with different requirements and regulations that require users and us to be cognizant of all that. I'm actually a little pessimistic about all that happening, but that's what I hope happens.
I think that we are going to see more of it. But one thing that I'm constantly trying to help politicians understand is that what is the goal you're trying to achieve? And are the measures you're putting in place, are the pieces of software or tools that you're using really driving the end goal, or is it just an idea and a spirit? One thing about crypto is you have very unique tools to monitor certain types of behavior, to try and make associations between different addresses, different wallets, perhaps assign a higher risk profile to an address and say, that's on our individual blacklist. But some of the AML stuff, I think, is becoming a bit onerous. I think that there is going to absolutely be more of it. But I think it's important to also keep in mind, what are we achieving here, and is it accurate? Are we actually getting the result that we want? There was a study, I think, that came out by the UN that was showing that in traditional banking, a lot of the AML compliance that's been put in place it's well under 2% effective of actually achieving its goal. And crypto, I mean, there's a lot of cost to doing these things, and there's some importance to it, but also we have to make sure that we're getting the outcome, that something like Chainalysis isn't doing the same thing and perhaps is as or more efficient at actually achieving whatever that, you know, group of senators or whoever's pushing forward a bill. Let's look at, you know, back to the drawing board. What are different ways we can think about these problems? Because again, the end user is going to find an access point. They're going to do the activity that they want no matter what. The question is, can you monitor and try and ensure that they're somewhat protected and doing best practices and not performing any type of illicit activity?
It's very interesting, the interplay between anonymity and transparency. To what extent, you know, will anonymity need to be sacrificed in order to allow the industry to go forward? To what extent is transparency in transactions, does that need to be reflected in transparency with end users? It's a very nuanced kind of discussion. And as you say, you know, I think it changes that from person to person, from platform to platform, and from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So it's going to be, so there's no one answer to this.
And this is also not unique to crypto. I mean, this is a conversation that's just happening in society and where we're at in time. COVID illustrated this, where you have something like a vaccine passport that allows you to go into certain restaurants, you know, in certain jurisdictions to eat a bowl of pasta. And then in certain places, you can't go in because you didn't get vaccinated. And so society is deciding how much transparency, how much do we want to collectively as a group align on certain initiatives, even though we have to give something up for it. What amount of surveillance when you walk down the street is appropriate? When do we go too far and it crosses the line? There's no answers to these things. It's just a constant debate. And it's the same thing that's happening in crypto.
And Brian, you touched on effectivity, and I think that's really important, is like, you know, and I don't want to be cynical, but sometimes I feel like some of these things are done for effect or for ceremony and not for effectivity. And like, if there's better ways to do it, we should embrace the most effective way to get the desired outcome that we want to get, and not just something for show or makes people feel good, right? So and we see that all the time in our society, right? With we saw it with COVID, we see it. I'm a little fearful we'll see it with regulation in the crypto industry, but certainly I think we should look at those outcomes we want to get, not the ceremony of it.
Coming back to your previous point about you know, what level we as a society choose, we've got a very interesting question, which I think alludes to that in one particular country. But how will super apps affect the crypto industry, both from an access and an identity perspective? Very interesting. The more that we go online on one particular platform, will crypto be the currency that powers all that, the oil, the electricity that is the energy that makes it all happen? How do you see super apps developing?
Yeah, you know, it's a convenience versus danger and control trade-off, right? So, I mean, I think we'd all love to have like one app to do everything, and you know, but then look at the incredibly rich ecosystem we have today, and kind of, you know, I think of a lot of this as like a trade-off between like mediocrity and best of breed. I think most of us want best of breed. So if I want to book travel, if I want to, you know, I don't know, post a comment somewhere, or social media, or a picture, or I want to participate in, you know, finance in some way, I want the best way to do it. And I want the freedom to choose, you know, what I think is the best way to do it. So the super app scares me a little bit in terms of having to say, well, I only have one choice, and whatever they decide to enable on the platform is what I'm left with. So personally, I feel a little bit, you know, fenced in by that, and would hope that we have an open, vibrant ecosystem across apps like we do across finance.
Okay, there's some other questions I want to address. What are your thoughts on the entertainment industry within Web3? For instance, Netflix brought Blockbuster down. What do you think could compete with Netflix? And follow on, I asked because there was a recent study done where Hollywood is leaving $10 billion on the table by not producing independent creators or taking that risk. How do you see Web3 streaming services becoming user-friendly for others in Web3?
I think that, this goes back to my comment before around you're seeing agency be disrupted by technology. And we're going to see that across every industry. Chris Dixon famously said, software is eating the world, and it will touch every industry and entertainment as well. The good news is that, again, as you remove that agency, you lower the costs and you can have a direct relationship between a content creator and a consumer. Perhaps the payment is lower because you're not extracting fees along the way through multiple distribution channels. And you can maybe get rid of the advertising and let an end user pay direct for the content that they want to consume. I also think that content is going to be far more bizarre than what we're used to today. The same way that, NFTs are going to start challenging what art is. You're going to start to see in-game assets find their way into marketplaces and be tradable on something like an OpenSea. And so what is entertainment? Traditionally, I think we've mostly said, well, it's movies and it's television and it's music. But now you're having a group of people who are going to grow up saying it's going to be a whole different set of experiences. You have TikTok that challenges Netflix, but it seems bizarre because they're 10-second videos created by people on their phones. And so we're just going to see the acceleration of that world. And it's going to be hard to grasp. I don't know how Netflix and the big media companies fit in, but there is an opportunity there to embrace the new technology to say, how do we use NFTs? How do we engage a community perhaps in a different way than they have historically? And say, can we use those as tools to have a different immersive experience or brand loyalty be stewarded by these people who are financially incentivized or feel that they have some exclusive content because of some digital asset they're holding? I think we need to embrace that more and see those businesses lean in and say, we need to get creative and hire people who know nothing about reading a script. They don't know about how to finance a film, but they are identifying with this next generation who's consuming content in a very different way than we ever have before. And there's some real opportunity there.
Yeah, I saw a move afoot to create a game based on blockchain. And so decentralized control of a game environment, not controlled by a traditional tech giant, but controlled by the people who play the game. And so I think there's lots of things, again, going back to our, we probably can't imagine where some of this will go, but lots of opportunity to innovate across the entertainment space. Whether it's streaming or gaming or other things, I think there's going to be a really fantastic future ahead of us in some of these areas.
Yeah. Also, just to keep in mind, every time you have a new tech platform come out, there's a changing of the guard. So, the silent era film stars didn't become the talkie. When talking pictures came about, those weren't the same stars, and they didn't become the television actors who didn't become the Instagram influencers. The Instagram influencers don't necessarily become the TikTok, celebrities. And so every time we have this new platform, it's different companies that emerge who are maybe more nimble, they're more native to that technology, they're a different generation. And so I think it's really important for these big existing businesses to think hard about what are new models going to look like to try and, as best they can, avoid the disruption.
Yeah, we featured some really, really innovative companies on CoinDesk recently that are just taking the concepts of Web3 and applying them to their own little niches and coming up with some great ideas. So that, I'm thinking of one in the stock photography and video niche, just giving all the power back to the users, and then using tokens to reward them and things like that. I mean, in the sports world, I think there's a huge application for Web3. There's one already with a sailing competition that is almost entirely sort of tokenized, but it is an actual real sailing competition called Sail GP. So yeah, I think these things are happening, and it's I think we can be distracted by what's going on in the money aspect of it, in the high-end trading environment. Captures all the headlines, but I think you're absolutely right, both of you, in saying that there are 1,000 flowers blooming out there, and this is probably going to be the future, the next wave of the crypto industry. We have reached the top of the hour. I want to thank you both so much for this fascinating discussion. I know it's a difficult time for all of us, and I know you guys are super busy, and there is so much going on. I mean, but I just would like to give a quick kind of recap for what we've discussed. It is a tough time, but the industry is probably going to get better as a result. This hurts now, but things will come back stronger. It will affect the regulations. There'll probably be more onus on the end user to take control of their own wallets. At the same time, the regulations could become more onerous, or certainly around KYC and some of the other points. But this all needs to be balanced out. We want to ensure that the end user can have access and can still participate in this, and in not just a purely financial way, but as we said, the use cases are proliferating. We don't want to create a whole series of different, should we say, walled gardens, either at a national level or at a vertical level. There needs to be interoperability, and we need to lower, as far as we can, friction. And this can be definitely done through ID verification, through systems, through platforms. But again, we need to balance out the level of trust that we're willing to put everything in one basket versus the need to have lots of different areas. So it is an absolute balancing act. A couple of points that also stuck out: we absolutely need to develop a better lexicon to go forward, to make, on the UX side, to make this more user-friendly, and we need to abstract out a lot of the technicals that are still there front and center. So both of you, again, thank you so much for this discussion. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I hope it's helped our audience to see the bigger picture at a time when we're all glued to Twitter, we're trying to see what the latest news is, and watching prices gyrate around. So there is a bigger picture. It is positive. There will be a new wave of crypto and crypto adoption, and there will be lots of new ways that this is going to carry on changing the world. So from me and everyone at CoinDesk, thank you again, Hal. Thanks, Brian. And we hope to see you next time at our next webinar. Good night.